Hello, this is HistoryNet, and today I'm joined with Druce Gildas, who runs Gnostic Mysticism. Introduce yourself, Druce.
Hi everyone. I can hear
Tell
myself.
Tell us all about yourself and what you do.
Well, as far as YouTube is concerned, I speak about Gnosticism from a mystic perspective. The username Gnostic Mysticism, it's somewhat redundant because Gnosticism is inherently mystical. But given that so many different kinds of people like to call themselves Gnostics in the present day, I think it's necessary to emphasize that this is a decidedly mystical approach to the Gnostic tradition.
Okay. Explain to us how your journey led you to where you are now, and how did you come to determine Gnosticism was the way?
Well, I was born and brought up in the Highlands of Scotland, where I still live, and Scotland is a very secular country, so I wasn't raised religious at all. But my family and most people around here, and to this day, my friends as well, they're not anti-theistic. They're not opposed to religion. They just don't think about that kind of thing at all. But I innately had an interest in the big questions in life, and so growing up, I wondered about these big questions in life, and so I explored many different spiritual paths, but none of them really resonated with me particularly. I looked at Christianity in my teenage years, and I think I kind of felt what a lot of people feel about Christianity. And it's a very silly thing, but it's honestly how I felt. But I kind of felt that it was the vanilla religion because it was very much the Western religion. It wasn't exotic like something like Buddhism or Hinduism. And so, a typical arrogant teenager, I just dismissed it without really giving it a chance. And so things went on, and then in my late 20s, specifically at the age of 27, I reached a place where I decided that maybe there was nothing to discover, and I was content with it, but I still hadn't gotten anywhere, even though I had a lot of knowledge in my head regarding all these different spiritual traditions. But one day in my office in mid 2012, I had a spiritual experience, and it was just mind blowing to me. I went into the office one morning and I sat down in front of my computer, and I was thinking about prayer. And that was nothing unusual for me because, as I said, I always like to consider the big questions in life. But suddenly it was like an epiphany, but a mind blowing epiphany. And I just felt God all around me, permeating the space around me. And of course, not being brought up within a religious context, I didn't have any, there were no labels for me to assign to that experience. I didn't know what had happened, but I instinctively attributed it to the person of Jesus Christ. And so that brought me to Christianity. I attended a Baptist church for a while, but even then I still had an interest in the big questions. So long story short, throughout the years, I eventually arrived at Gnosticism because, you said something to me earlier in private messages. You said that you feel that no one tradition can contain the entire truth. They may have pieces of the truth, but they can't contain it all. And that's very much how I feel. I adhere to the Gnostic tradition because I find it resonates with me. I think it's the most insightful, but I'm not sectarian. I have problems with organized religion generally, but I fully acknowledge that there's been wonderful Catholics, wonderful Protestants, wonderful Hindus, wonderful Muslims. These different religions are just different ways of looking at a transcendent truth. And because they exist in this realm of duality, they obviously manifest in different ways according to certain cultures and certain histories, but they are all fundamentally trying to get at the same truth. And when you hear mystics talk from any tradition, they always talk in the same way because they're all reaching that same transcendent truth. So that's what I'd say there, I guess.
Yeah, that's similar to where I'm at. Various faiths and beliefs have truth to them, and no one denomination's nailed it yet because of human fickleness and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. When people hear of Gnosticism, they often get the idea of pseudo Christians who, while they believe Jesus was divine, also believe that the God of the Old Testament, Yahweh, also known as Saklos or Ariel or other names, is evil, and Jesus spoke on behalf of the one true God who is out there somewhere. Would you kindly elaborate on that?
Well, there's a lot to say on that subject. I think a good thing to say from the very beginning is that there's always an exoteric side of religion and an esoteric side. The exoteric side being the surface level understanding that most people will adhere to. You see this in every religion, and this is true of Gnosticism as well. So the idea that Gnostics believed that an evil god created the material world and that they associated that evil god with Yahweh. Yeah, it's true if you want to take that mythology so literally, but I don't take any mythology so literally because they're not meant to be taken literally. They're symbolic of different things. The demiurge, as he's known in Gnosticism, he is a personification of one part of the duality that is present in the material realm. The other part of that duality being represented by the evil one, or Satan, as some traditions call him. But fundamentally, the demiurge is a personification of order, whereas the evil one is a personification of chaos. And of course, those two powers, if you like, they form the duality here in the material realm. Now, the true God, the God of Jesus, the Father, or the ineffable one, as he's sometimes called in Gnostic tradition, he transcends such dualities. And so, yeah, Gnostic myths, the thing about the Gnostics is that when they crafted their myths, they did so intentionally to symbolize certain things. They were intentionally into myth crafting. When Gnostics created these elaborate mythologies about the monad and all these different things emanating from the monad and about Sophia and all these different things that people associate with Gnosticism, they did so intentionally because these things symbolize certain other things. So you can look at these Gnostic myths from a literal perspective, but that's really as pointless as looking at the story of the Garden of Eden from a literal perspective. The true depth and the meaning comes from understanding these things symbolically. And in terms of symbology, the demiurge is again symbolic of order, symbolic of cause and effect, karma, and that's why he is associated with entities like the Old Testament Yahweh, because the Yahweh of the Old Testament is a god of judgment, is a god of recompense, as opposed to being a god that is interested in grace as the Father of Jesus is. So that's a very expansive question, but I guess if I was to put it all in a nutshell, that would be how I'd do it.
Right. Many people get a lot of people struggle with the idea that the God of the Old Testament and the New Testament are the same.
Yes, this is a very, very old problem, and it's, I think the biggest issue people will have when it comes to this is the fact that in the Synoptic Gospels, at least, Jesus very much talks that way. You know, he's very much a first century rabbi who fully acknowledges Yahweh as his father. So, yeah, that's a great boundary to overcome for many. But I think probably the greatest obstacle or the greatest issue is the fact that most of those people are taking those Old Testament stories literally in the first place. So if you believe that this Yahweh did all those things in the Old Testament, then I think it's going to be harder for you to accept the fact that Yahweh is not the true God, purely because you take those things literally, whereas I don't take them literally. These are just mythologies that are crafted to impart lessons. And this is not some new understanding either. It's often thought that literalism, as far as understanding the scriptures goes, is the original way of looking at them, but that's not true at all. You can go back to like the early Catholic Church, for example, and you can find all kinds of really sophisticated, intricate interpretations of these myths. Like the story of the Garden of Eden, for example, it wasn't always taken literally. The more sophisticated theologians always understood it in a more as more of an allegory, the same way that I do. So this is not new stuff. It's just something that's been forgotten to a large degree, I think.
Right. I'm sure the Protestants and young Earth Christians who take these stories literally just irk the hell out of you. Same as me and most other people, right?
Yeah, I've heard you in certain live streams where I've heard you talk about this, and I'd very much agree with what I've heard you and others express on this subject. It's just very unfortunate, but this is why, again, I said there's an exoteric side of religion and an esoteric side to religion, an exoteric side to every tradition, and an esoteric side. The majority of people who have an interest in religion, they are only going to be capable of understanding the exoteric side, the very on the surface level understanding of things, the very literalistic understanding of things. But the real spirituality is to be found in the esoteric understanding, which is to say, the hidden or secret understanding.
Which leads to my next question. What is your outlook on the canonical gospels, the Gnostic gospels, and the rest of the other quote unquote gospels that were forgotten over time?
Well, again, it's a very expansive question. The Synoptic Gospel, first of all of these texts are designed to impart lessons more than they're designed to relay history. But the most reliable historical information, in my opinion, is to be found in the Synoptic Gospels and in the Gospel of Thomas. There you have a lot of correspondence, there are a lot of parallel texts, and historians would agree with me that they very likely go back to the historical Jesus. Whereas Gospels like the Gospel of John, well, that's what I would call a spiritual gospel, and that is something else that has been recognized from the earliest times. The Gospel of John was always a controversial gospel, purely because it's so different from the Synoptic Gospels. And there were many in the early church who didn't want to include it in canon, and people to this day have a problem with it. But the reason it's so different from the Synoptics is that it has a different purpose than the Synoptics. The Gospel of John has nothing to do with the historical Jesus. The author of John, or the community that wrote John, they only take incidents that occur in the Synoptics and put it in their narrative when it suits their narrative. And the point of their narrative is ultimately to tell us about the person of Jesus Christ as he exists in the Spirit. And they're just using a narrative concerning him going about his ministry to do that. That's all that's going on. And I could speak, I mean, I did an entire commentary on the Gospel of John. It's about 15, 16 hours long. So I could speak an awful lot about that. But I feel the Gnostic Gospels, especially the more elaborate ones like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Truth, they are very much like the Gospel of John in that they're not even attempting to relay history. Like the Gospel of Judas, for example, the author who wrote that, he had no illusions that he was relaying history. He was simply, again, crafting a mythology that was designed to impart certain lessons. And so if someone is looking for the historical Jesus, then you would look at the Synoptics and the Gospel of Thomas. But for those high spiritual truths, it would be not only those, but also the Gospel of John and the Gnostic texts.
I also heard that John was supposed to be partially a response to proto-Gnostic quote unquote heresies popping up at the time.
Yeah, I've heard that as well. Apparently, well, some say that John's arch enemy was Cerinthus, and that First John and certainly the Gospel of John was a response to him. But I disagree with that. I think
was the response to who?
Cerinthus. He was a Gnostic teacher.
Ah.
But I think that the Gospel of John is obviously a proto-Gnostic gospel. And when I say proto-Gnostic, what I mean is that it laid the foundations for what would later become Gnosticism. It's Gnostic through and through, the Gospel of John. And that's why a lot of people in the early church didn't like it, because they had that kind of suspicion. And I agree with that. I think it's blatantly a proto-Gnostic gospel. And that's why it's my favorite gospel.
Yeah, which leads to me asking you about what your outlook on the historical Jesus is. Like some would say, a lot of Christians, especially today, are divided on whether he was the Logos, the Word, the God incarnate all along, or attained it during his ministry, or attained it upon his resurrection. What's your outlook on that?
I have
since you say both mainstream Christians and non-believers have it wrong.
I have an adoptionist view, which is to say that he became the Son of God at his baptism, which is why the Gospels are almost entirely concerned with what happened from his baptism onwards. You know, if Jesus was the eternal God, you know, throughout his entire life, then you'd think the Gospels would be concerned with every aspect of his life, but they're not, because he was only the Son of God at his baptism. And to be a Son of God, as the Apostle Paul said, means to be led by the Spirit of God. But yes, I mean, I could talk about this. I mean, I could talk about this for 4 hours. So feel free to stop me. I'll try and go into a bit of detail here. So Jesus, of course, is also the Word of God. Now, the difference when it comes, you know, comparing Trinitarianism to, say, Unitarianism is how you interpret the word in the opening of John, because the assumption is on the part of Trinitarians that the word is a person, which obviously Unitarians would disagree with. And so you'd have to go back and understand what the word is in the first place. And in short, the word is the expression of God. It's how God expresses himself to his creation. You see, in the Gnostic view, God is incomprehensible. He cannot be understood. Now, everyone says that. You know, you'll hear Christians say, well, God is beyond our understanding. But then
Yeah.
the very next thing they'll do is tell you exactly what he's like. They'll define him and call you a heretic if you disagree. But when the Gnostics said that God couldn't be understood, they actually meant it. And so you have this incomprehensible God called the Ineffable One, or just the Father. And in order to make himself comprehensible to his creation, he expresses his word. And so in the Old Testament, for example, his word would come to the prophets. And that was the intent and the will of God. And those prophets, being appointed, they'd carry it out. Now, in the person of Jesus Christ, when the Spirit descended upon him at his baptism, he became the Word of God personified. And after his crucifixion and resurrection, he remains the Word of God to us up to the present day. So now, when the Word of God comes to a person, it comes in the form of another person, namely the person of Jesus Christ. As for the historical Jesus and, you know, what his actual physical life was about, I don't concern myself with that, because, you know, a Gnostic is one who knows, specifically one who knows through divine insight. As a Gnostic, I'm very focused on contemplation, on dreams, and divine revelation ultimately. But a Gnostic, while being one who knows through divine insight, I always say you should always be honest about what you don't know. And when it comes to the historical facts surrounding the historical Jesus, so much of that knowledge is just beyond us. We can have theories about it and we can speculate about it, but ultimately we're only dealing with probability. That's why I like to focus on experiential spirituality, knowing things through the Spirit, as opposed to speculating on historical matters that are quite beyond us. Now, again, I could talk for 4 hours about anything I just mentioned there. So if you want me to elaborate on any of it, then, you know, I will.
Elaborate on
it. At which part?
Like your divine insight, so to speak, or your the experience that led you to believe what you do now, or if you like.
Well, it was that experience I had in mid-2012 that woke me up to the reality of God. And then the question I had to ask myself is, well, what does God want ultimately? And I went through what I call my zeal of the convert stage. And you often find that people who convert to religion or to a new religion, they're very zealous, often to the point of being obnoxious. And I went through that period myself.
Right.
So I spent years just immersed in theology and history and the things that most religious people who are serious concern themselves with. And I soon realized the futility of it. All I had was a lot of information, a lot of knowledge, and no certainty. And I came to understand, to cut a long story short, that gnosis, knowledge, direct experience of the spiritual is all that matters. And so my focus in the present day is very much on what I call experiential spirituality, coming to know God through the Spirit. And that's what eternal life is, as Jesus said in John 17:3. This is eternal life, that they know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, who you sent. It's all about that gnosis. And for those of you watching who may not know, Gnosticism is an umbrella term for a number of groups, very much in the same way that Christian is an umbrella term. You know, if you meet someone who calls themselves a Christian, you really don't know much about them. All you really know is that they think they follow Jesus Christ, but they could believe all kinds of different things that distinguish them from other people who call themselves Christians. They're only united by this belief or this notion that they follow Jesus Christ. And the same is true within Gnosticism. Historically, the different Gnostic groups believed different things. What united Gnostic groups, and the reason they're able to be put under this umbrella term of Gnosticism, is this belief in gnosis. And again, gnosis refers to knowledge, but specifically to knowledge gained through divine insight. That's what gnosis is. And therefore, a Gnostic is one who knows, specifically one who knows through divine insight. That's why I said at the beginning, the term Gnostic mysticism, it's somewhat redundant because Gnosticism is inherently mystical. But unfortunately, in the present day, it's necessary to be very clear that that's what I'm dealing with. You see, a lot of people in the modern day, they claim the name Gnostic for themselves, but if you listen to them talk, they don't talk about anything that the ancient Gnostics actually talked about. They concern themselves with aliens and Nerebu and tripping out on LSD a lot. And it's unfortunate because that has nothing whatsoever to do with anything the ancient Gnostics said. So all I could say to people is, if you encounter someone who calls themselves a Gnostic, ask them what their Gnosticism is based on. Because if it's not based on Gnosticism as it's been understood historically, I mean, they can have their own ideas, but if it doesn't at least have a basis in historical Gnosticism, then it's not really Gnosticism, and they really have no justification for calling themselves a Gnostic. But that's what a Gnostic is. It's one who seeks to know God through divine insight. I went off on a few tangents there, but I thought it was necessary.
Right. So, what's your what's your idea of Lucifer or Satan, the enemy of God, the Nakash?
Well, I explained earlier that the demiurge is a personification of order. Satan is a personification of chaos. And you can see throughout Scripture that, for example, in the book of Job, Satan is very much portrayed as being a servant of God. But of course, I don't take such texts literally. They're mythologies. They're not meant to be taken literally. And then in the New Testament, of course, you have Satan who tests Jesus in the wilderness. You have Satan entering into Judas right before he betrays Jesus. Fundamentally, Satan is our own impulses. And the demons of Satan are just, again, those impulses that arise in the mind. So if you see a person wandering around speaking to themselves, completely consumed and in some kind of internal dialogue, you can truly say that that person has been possessed, because they have been. These impulses arise in the mind and they can no longer resist them. So they end up having this internal monologue with themselves. So Satan is a personification of a certain phenomenon in the material realm. He's not an actual entity that exists anywhere in a real sense. He's, again, just a personification of a certain force.
Right. I remember you saying one time that demons are just metaphors that represent our inner quote unquote demons, so to say.
Yeah, although it's worth saying, when people hear me say that, they think I'm being reductionist about these things, but not really. Put it this way, the way that I describe demons, they're more powerful than the way that someone with an exoteric understanding of religion understands demons. Someone with a very simplistic, exoteric understanding of religion, they think that demons exist in some shadowy realm somewhere. But for all intent and purposes, they're out of the way. But the way that I'm describing demons, these are things that afflict us day to day. You go to pray and meditate, you'll have these demons arise in your mind, these impulses arise in your mind. So the thing is, if you understand Satan as some evil entity out there somewhere, then it really ceases to have any use for you. But if you understand Satan as a force that operates through your mind, then you understand that the battle against Satan occurs all day, every day. And that's a far more useful understanding, and one that's far truer to the scriptures, in my opinion.
Anyway, I see our co-host showed up finally, Mr. Brass.
Hello there.
Hello.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I didn't get the link initially. I couldn't find it anywhere, but now I got it.
It finally found its way. All right. What would you what would you want both mainstream Christians and non-believers to think about the most? Anything to take home?
Well, I wasn't really expecting that one. Honestly, I've never been asked that. I've never even thought about it. Gnosticism historically has not been very evangelistic, so I don't really think about, what I'm going to say to other people. I mean, I could go into the Gnostic view on other people, but to sum it up, anyone who there are those who have the a spirit. Human beings are just flesh and blood. Some of them have spirit, some of them don't. Those with spirit will inevitably be drawn back to the truth, and so I don't have to worry about them. And those that don't have the spirit, well, no amount of convincing them is going to bring them there. So I don't think.
Elaborate on that, would you kindly?
Well,
About
in the Gnostic
about certain
system,
about certain humans having spirit and others not having, like having a soul and others not.
I
well,
think that
this is
also ties into like Genesis, I believe, like the whole pre-Adamic theory.
one thing the Gnostics are known for, besides the demiurge and Sophia, is the fact that they divided humanity up into three categories. So you have, at the lowest level, the hylics, those of matter, the psychics, those of the intellect, and the pneumatics, those of the spirit. The terms I use for modern audiences are the materialists, the intellectuals, and the mystics. I think modern people understand those terms far better. No one knows what a hylic is. And if you say psychic to someone, they think of someone who can read minds. Now the hylics, they are uninitiated and they are doomed. The psychics, they might be saved in most Gnostic systems, but the mystics are the only ones who have any certainty of what you would call salvation. And the hylics, being matter, being just flesh and blood, well, they are doomed, because only spirit can grow to spirit. Matter can't become spirit. The Gnosticism has a very negative view of matter generally, and I certainly retain that view. And yeah, that's all I can say on that, really.
So, how would one attain this spirit?
You can't attain it. You either have it or you don't. That's another difference between, so not even have it, are it, more like. See, that's one difference between, I guess, the canonical scriptures and the Gnostic view. Although arguably you could see this in the Gospel of John. You see, in the canonical scriptures, you have human beings and they receive the Holy Spirit. But in the Gnostic view, you are spirit, and you're either a spirit or you're not. So someone who is just a machine of flesh and blood, they can't obtain a spirit. They're just a machine of flesh and blood. Whereas the ones who are spirit, they are spirit encased, trapped in flesh. And so that's the distinction between them. And there's no changing that. Ultimately, when Genesis says that man was made in the image of God, it's referring to our soul, not to our physical form. Human beings are just animals. And so you have a certain number of spirits being trapped within flesh. But of course, human beings, being animals, they will breed like other animals. And so you have human beings breeding and breeding and breeding. And there are far more human beings, purely animal human beings, than there are human beings who are in fact spirit, if you know what I mean.
Right, going back to Jesus earlier about there being no childhood account of him, there was the infancy narrative in the Gospel of Thomas where he's kind of like a demon child. Like, what would happen if all the power in the universe was given to this little kid and he abuses his power, killing
Yeah,
off his instructors and showing off his friends, stuff like that?
yeah, the infancy Gospel of Thomas. And just to distinguish, just for the audience, there's the Gospel of Thomas and there's an infancy Gospel of Thomas, as it's sometimes called. And they're very different things, and I really haven't studied the latter ultimately.
Yeah, and also like when we also take into account like, I mean, it's sort of better than what the Hindus really suggest, is that that Jesus in his teenage years or whatever you call it, in his childhood years, came to India or somewhere where he trained under like Buddhist teaching and then came back and just reflected the Buddha's teachings.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like teenager around that time.
there's a lot of similarities between Jesus' teachings and Buddha, but we don't know what he was doing between the age of, you've got in the Gospel of Matthew and the Gospel of Luke, you've got his birth. The Gospel of Luke mentions an event when he was 12 years old, but what he was doing between 12 years old and the age of 30 or 33, we just don't know. And like I said earlier, I don't speculate about those things because that's it's pointless.
Assume
Well,
he
I
grew up
mean,
like
we do, yeah. We do know in his adult years that he hung out with hookers.
Yeah.
and drunks.
Yeah, so I think that could be some testament to what he was doing as a child, in his teenage years.
Ah. Yeah. Okay, let's see what if anybody's got questions. Liam Kierbhale asks, David, can you please elaborate on your prayer life, please?
Well, there's a lot to say on that as well. I mean, in what sense? The way I like to say it is that prayer is speaking to God and meditation is listening to God. And it wouldn't be very good to go up to someone and say your piece and then walk away before they can respond. So I always emphasize that when you pray to God, follow what Jesus said, and keep it very simple. As it's funny, atheists will often, as some kind of gotcha, they'll often say, well, what's the point of asking God for anything if he already knows, what you want or what you need? But the funny thing is that if you look in the Gospel of Matthew, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said that right before he told his disciples the Lord's Prayer. He said, God already knows what you need before you ask him. So this is something very obvious and something that's been known for some time. But this is what's crucial to understand about prayer, is that while most people understand prayer as making a wish, it's fundamentally communion with God. And of course, God doesn't need us to commune with him. The point is that it benefits our spiritual life when we do that, regardless of whether we're asking for something or we're simply talking to God. I like to use the metaphor of a radio. We are tuned in to a very low frequency in our day-to-day lives. We have to be to operate in the material realm. That's one of the reasons that prayer and meditation are so important, because through such contemplative practices, we learn to tune ourselves in to higher frequencies, if you will. That's the true value of prayer. It's not making a wish, and it's not really about getting what we want from God.
Right.
So that's what I'd say on the subject of prayer. I'd happily elaborate on any more specific questions, but they would have to be specific.
It's more like a caricature of what prayer is, like asking God for a wish, like a genie, or fulfill your every desire as a wish fairy.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, I've always sort of seen it as it's a way of recognizing God as an authority figure in a way.
Well, it certainly helps keep you humble. When you go into those really deep places in prayer and meditation, yeah, you can't help but feel humble, and that's what it's all about. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount, he tells us to go into our inner chamber and pray. Now, the exoteric understanding of that is that you pray in secret, which is good because it's good to be humble. You don't want to be like the Pharisees who prayed to be seen by men. But the esoteric understanding is that your inner chamber is inside you. And that's what it is. It means to go deep inside you. That's what spirituality is all about. To know oneself is to know God. That's not because we are God, just to clarify. It's because we are spirits that are one portion of that great spirit that we call God. It was Saint Francis of Assisi, just to make your audience comfortable with a more orthodox voice. It was Saint Francis of Assisi that said, what I was looking for was where I was looking from. And so it's very much that kind of inner journey that I like to focus on, because that's fundamentally what it's all about.
This Melting Pot channel, give your own voice.
I mean, one thing is I was hearing how you were saying that they either have it or they don't. Would you say it's at least your branch of Gnosticism is, how does it stand with things like free will?
I think that there's probably no more difficult question than free will. the answer to free will is that we have it to a degree from a certain perspective, but ultimately not. We have the choice, as Jesus said, whoever commits sin is a slave to sin. We ultimately have a binary choice between serving God and serving the flesh. And our choices beyond that don't count for much, because if we're serving God, we're going to do certain things for sure. And if we're serving the flesh, we're going to do certain things for sure. So we have a binary choice between good and evil, as Yahweh says, choose this day who you will serve. And that's the choice we make from moment to moment throughout the day. So it's a very complicated question. And it's one of those questions that I don't speak about a lot, because it leaves people speculating in ways that I don't think are useful.
So in Gnosticism, you can't choose to serve both God and the flesh.
Absolutely not. And just in accordance with the words of Jesus, a man cannot serve two masters.
Interesting. Theistic Logos asks, does he believe Jesus was crucified?
Yeah, I have no reason not to believe it. Do I know it? No. And this is something that's very important. This is one of the most difficult things that I say, but it's undeniably true, is that, as I said earlier, when it comes to the historical life of Jesus, what happened to him historically, none of us know. None of us know. We can read the Gospels and choose to believe it, but we don't know. On a historical basis, we're dealing with probability. The reason that in answer to the question, do I believe that Jesus was crucified? Well, most historians seem to agree that Jesus was indeed crucified. So fine, I have no way of knowing anything to the contrary, and I have no way of knowing or proving to anyone that that indeed happened. What is important is that I go through and I pray and I meditate and I speak to and I hear from God and Jesus, and that's what it's all about. It's far more important that I have that spiritual life, that communion through the Spirit, than that I know that a guy called Jesus once lived 2,000 years ago, because one naturally leads to the other. If I call upon the name of Jesus or Yeshua, and my life is empowered through that, as it has been, by the way, since that experience in mid 2012, calling upon the Father and calling upon Jesus, my life has done a 180-degree shift. That's the proof. That's the real proof. Beyond any apologetics, beyond any historical argumentation, that is the true testimony. Anyone who knows me in real life, and I use my real name online, I don't segregate my online life from my real life. Anyone in my real life will tell you what a dramatic change I've undergone in the last few years, and that's all down to Jesus. And that's the best testimony of any kind of spirituality that anyone can give, as a transformed life and a life that is led day after day, being empowered by the Spirit. So, do I believe Jesus was crucified? Yeah, but frankly, I don't think about it too much, because it's not as important with coming to know Jesus here and now through the Spirit.
What changes in your life exactly would you care to share about?
Well, everything from the most major to the most minor things. I no longer drink alcohol. I don't curse anymore. I used to curse with every second word. And naturally, when you start on a spiritual path and you live in a place where I do this very secular, you begin to grow apart from people, because they see that you're changing in certain ways and they're not able to go with you. And so things just fall away. I live a very reclusive life in the present day. I very much like my own company. Since I do have a focus on contemplative practice, it's necessary for me to seclude myself. And so, yeah, my life has just changed 100 and in every conceivable way. In fact, you're asking, in what ways did my life change? I'm actually sitting here thinking, in what ways did my life not change? But yeah, in those kind of ways.
Yeah, you're secluded. You live in Highland.
Yeah, but secluded even for a Highlander.
I love that movie, by the way.
Yeah.
Okay, so Brass, any questions?
I mean, I got some of one of the questions I was looking forward to. So, I actually do remember, I know, like, your form of Gnosticism. I've heard something similar to it in the Middle Ages. I I know that there was one sect that really, I don't know if it was Gnostic per se, but I know they sort of believed that there was a constant struggle between matter and the spiritual. Does that sort of like tie in, or is that like separate?
You mean the Cathars?
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yeah, the Cathars were definitely a Gnostic group. In fact, I said earlier, if someone calls themselves a Gnostic, ask them what their Gnosticism is based on, just to make sure that they've not just taken the name because they think it's edgy or something. My own Gnosticism is very similar to both Valentinian Gnosticism and the Cathars. I very much love the Cathars, and yes, throughout most Gnosticism, not all Gnosticism, but most of it, and certainly in my own, you do have this stark duality between the material and the spiritual. Uh, Gnostics are often accused of hating the world, and even as a Gnostic myself, I can understand why, because it is quite a dark view in many ways, but it's just the way I see things. Matter, from my own perspective, is ultimately illusory. As I actually said earlier on today, in the same way that darkness is the absence of light, so true matter is absence of the spirit. And the Gnostic creation myth, the material realm, that which is called the deficiency, it was the product of ignorance. It was the product of a catastrophe of some kind. And it is ultimately illusory. All that truly exists is spirit, and it will ultimately be destroyed when every spirit that is currently trapped here escapes. I'm sure all of you have seen The Matrix, and that's famously a film that takes a lot of cues from Gnosticism, and it's a very similar concept to that. The idea that you're essentially in a simulation, this illusion of the material realm, when in fact all that truly exists is spirit.
I mean, that sort of rings true to me, like what I've seen inspiring philosophy, and some like philosophers like Keith Ward argue for like idealism. Would you say like idealism is close to, or somewhat similar to your Gnosticism?
What do you mean by idealism?
Idealism is the thought that basically that instead of like materials believe that material is all that exists. The idealists believe that the mind is all that exists, and material is just really the illusion of it.
Yeah, that I could go. I could go along with that. Yeah.
See if there's any more questions.
See, the way to understand the Gnostic cosmology and the creation myth, if you like, is to understand Plato's forms. This idea that you have this monad that contains at least the potentiality of everything in itself, and then things emanate from that. And the further away they emanate from this original source, the less pure they become, if you like. So, to use an example, if we see an image of beauty here in the world, we're only seeing a lesser form of beauty. Whereas in higher realms, if you like, beauty exists in a more pure essence. And so, for example, whenever someone has a spiritual experience, and I know this from my own experiences, but let's take a really well-known spiritual experience, something like a near-death experience. They'll often come back and say, the love I felt, it was so overwhelming, the peace I felt, it can't be put into words. And even after my own spiritual awakening, when I describe it in the modern day, I'll still say, there's no words to describe how much joy I felt and how much peace I felt, because there isn't. And that's because when you have those transcendent experiences, you are experiencing higher forms of these things that we recognize in the world. So here in the material realm, we speak of love, but when we have those transcendent experiences and we experience love in them, love takes on a whole different meaning. So yeah, that a good way to understand the Gnostic cosmology is to understand Plato's forms.
Yeah, I mean, I'm since I'm more I go into Aristotle. I also have looked at a little bit of Plato, and yeah, I know a little bit about the forms. I liked how he sort of Plato went into Platonic, more like moral Platonism, where he says there's ultimately like a thing like justice is just sort of out there. Like when we appeal to it here, we just have this like idealization of what justice really is, and that idealization is real, but it's in the Platonic realm.
Right. You'll see throughout the Gnostic texts images, the word images being used a lot, and that's what they were referring to there. We have these, we might have these concepts, or we might have representations of certain things here in the world, but ultimately they're not close to being the thing itself.
So, I mean, you'd be familiar with like the idea of accidents and substances, or forms and substances.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, that goes more into Aristotle than Plato necessarily. But yeah, like the idea like an accident is just a modification, but it doesn't really change the form.
Right.
It's like I sort of give the example of like, let's say you have a cat and you dye its fur red. you have added an accident to the cat, but just because you've added like the redness of the fur to the cat, you haven't taken like what is essentially the cat.
Yeah, the cat has its own essence, its own. Yeah, I get you.
Yeah. That's sort of how I sort of use the metaphor. Ed Phaser goes like more like with a tree analogy. I think the cat really, it has more edges, I think. I don't know if you know who Ed Phaser is. He's sort of like a Christian philosopher.
Yeah, the name rings a bell. I listen to so much material that I'm bound to have heard of everyone, but I don't know his work, unfortunately.
Kuhn in the live chat asks, "What is your interpretation of hell?"
Well, just as Jesus said, the kingdom of heaven is within you, so is hell. Heaven and hell are just states of consciousness. In truth, we never go anywhere, we've never been anywhere. I like to say we're all lying in the bosom of the Father right now, just imagining this reality. And ultimately, it's about where our mind is. You can see people in hell wandering about in their day-to-day lives here in the world, and you can see people in heaven as well. And the reason those people are in hell is because they put themselves there through their own choices. The reason people are in heaven is because they engage in contemplative practices in order to turn their frequency to that realm, if you like. But beyond physical death of us, first of all, it's important to say that within Gnosticism, most Gnostic groups, and including my own beliefs, reincarnation is a reality. So there's no such thing as eternal hell. What there is a confrontation with one's own self after the spirit leaves the physical body. And so I'm sure most of you have heard of the famous life review that people go through in near-death experiences. That is a spirit meeting one's own self once they've been departed from their body, and they will eventually be reborn. It's very similar to the Buddhist view. Spirits are reborn until they are liberated, until they achieve liberation in the Gnostic view, my Gnostic view as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could also see some similarities between like, your view of free will and sort of like how the view of karma works.
Yeah, exactly.
About how karma, I mean, a lot of people have some simplistic views of karma, although I've seen some more complicated views proposed by philosophers on it, where it's not just what you do that reflects what is going to happen to you next, but it's also what you fail to do or what you don't do that also comes to it.
Absolutely. What I find now, I know this from the testimonies of others who've had near-death experiences, and I also know it from my own contemplative practices, that you are confronted with yourself. And what seems to matter most in my experience, and this is just my experience, take it for what it's worth, is that what's really more important is, well, two things. First of all, your intent and how things affected other people. So your intent and how things affected other people. So if you hurt someone, but your intent was good, that's not so bad. But if you intentionally went out to hurt someone and you did, that is the worst thing. And I know that it may sound strange to people, this idea that we judge ourselves ultimately, but you've got to appreciate that in the context of this judgment, you are out of your flesh and you are aware of the divine. Imagine how ashamed you'd feel If imagine how ashamed you'd feel if every bad thing you've ever done was being displayed on a big screen to other human beings. That would be a terrible thing, a very embarrassing, a very trying thing. But imagine then, in the presence of this glorious, beautiful entity, that this is being known that you did these things in front of this glorious entity. So we do judge ourselves in light of what we then learn about reality as it actually is.
You mentioned demons are just metaphors. Would you also say the same of angels?
Yes, fundamentally, but again, when it comes down to it, when we speak about questions of psychology, if I explain demons as impulses that arise in the mind, which they are, again, when Judas went out to betray Jesus, it says Satan entered into him in the Gospel of John. Anyway, people think I'm being very, very reductivist about it, but I'm not really, because where's the line between spirituality and psychology at the end of the day? And what I'm essentially saying is that the kind of mythological narratives that you have in the Bible, that was the way the ancient people expressed such truths. And if you literalize them, then you miss the point altogether. And that's very much what we see in the modern day.
So spirituality. Go on.
I mean, yeah. Fun fact, psychology really took off in America by studying actually demon possessions.
That doesn't surprise me at all. It was Carl Jung who called Gnostics the first psychologists.
One Christian might ask, or a non-believer might ask you, why the one true God would allow this heresy of Christianity to go on as long as it did, and not Gnosticism.
You mean, like, from my Gnostic perspective, why would God allow the mainstream Christians to go on?
Right.
I think these are the kind of things we just can't know. Ultimately, I think everything has a purpose. Ultimately, this is again goes back to the whole free will question. Is that from our perspective, we have a binary choice between good and evil, but ultimately, the Father, the ineffable one, the alien God, as it were, he knows everything. He knew everything that was going to happen, and it is all working towards some kind of plan. But I think what that plan is and what his intents are is far beyond us, and I don't trouble myself with it. I'm just happy. I ask him to send me dreams and visions. He does that. I try to grow in grace. I try to improve my conduct, and that's good enough for me. Knowing the plan of God, I'm not that ambitious.
Kuhn in Light Chat asks, "What's your opinion on polytheism?"
Well, going back to the discussion of forms earlier, I think it's very possible that, well, if you look at pagan religions, for example, or pagan belief systems, sometimes their deities were blatantly just personifications of elements of the natural world. But when they weren't that, they were almost always principles of some kind. And so what you have is those Platonic forms being personified in the exact same way that Satan, or the evil one, is a personification of chaos, and the demiurge is a personification of order. These all represent something. But if the question, see, when people ask certain questions, they could be asking from a number of angles. If the question is, do I think that polytheists are condemned? No, it depends on the person. Again, I'm not sectarian in that way. What matters is how people conduct themselves and the relationship they have with the spirit. What form their tradition takes is really quite irrelevant to me.
So it's more orthopraxy, but not orthodoxy, really.
Yeah.
Do you think Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle might have had close to an idea of Gnosticism, even though they were monolateralists?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I didn't quite hear the question.
Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were monolatarists, or also polytheists to a certain extent, recognizing the one prime mover above others. But would you say they also had a slight idea of Gnosticism?
Oh, undoubtedly. The Gnostics are Neoplatonists. Ultimately, that's what Gnosticism is. It's Neoplatonism. It's essentially Judaism or slash Christianity understood through the lens of Neoplatonism. I mean, I'm sure you've all heard of the Nag Hammadi Library. That's where works like the Gospel of Thomas and several other Gnostic works were uncovered. But also in the Nag Hammadi Library, which was found in 1945, they found a copy of Plato's Republic. And that's no coincidence. The fact is that Gnostics are ultimately Neoplatonists. The Christian Gnostics are just Neoplatonists who understand that paradigm through the Christian view. And so the Platonic monad then becomes the father of Jesus. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can't speak too much for Aristotle and Socrates because I'm not as familiar with them as I am with Plato, but absolutely, Plato is the one who created the concept of the demiurge in the first place. The Gnostics just took that and tried to understand it in light of Christian theology, Christian and Jewish theology.
Well, yeah, I mean, with Aristotle, he more or less took some of Plato's ideas but modified them to a degree in order to fix what he, like, in his mind, fix them. I would see that Aristotle was, like, it really depends on how you really define it, but Aristotle was, his beliefs, like, with the prime mover were sort of deistic when you actually look at it, because he never really attributed emotions to the prime mover, really. It was very simple being. Like, he took divine simplicity to a very higher level.
Apparently, he also believed in the other pagan gods, even though he saw the myths as fairy stories and they didn't look like humans.
It's funny. I think that people forget that, when modern people think of someone like Plato and certainly Pythagoras, because they're associated with intellectual pursuits and even mathematics and things like that, they tend to think of them as really dry intellectuals, but they weren't. They were very mystical in their outlook. It's fascinating to read their works and see how much of the supernatural is inherent to them. That always strikes me as interesting.
Well, I mean, yeah, even with Socrates, even though he was accused of atheism, although that was basically just not believing in the gods of that particular of the state, he even mentioned how he believed in, like, he had the voice of God in his head or whatever they said, and he truly felt that. So I think that would be sort of like how with your Gnosticism goes with it. At least with Socrates.
What is your...
I'm not really, again, not too familiar with that.
What is your outlook on Paul?
The Apostle Paul?
Yeah.
He is... the Apostle Paul was once called the Apostle of the Heretics because it seemed that every heretical group loved him, and the Apostle Paul was always the favourite of the Gnostics, and it's not hard to see why. If you read his epistles, the Gnostic view of things, including the three divisions of humanity that I mentioned earlier, that's laid out right there in specifically 1 Corinthians. And so the Gospel of John and the epistles of Paul, they were always really beloved texts among the Gnostics. I'm sure many of you have heard of Marcion before. He was a proto-Gnostic, and he was the first that we know of to devise a canon, and his canon consisted of the Gospel of Luke, or at least an altered version of it, and several epistles of Paul. And so Paul has always been beloved by groups that strayed from orthodoxy, which made him suspicious in the eyes of many. But I personally, like the Gnostic groups before me, I love the Apostle Paul. Certainly my favorite apostle.
All right, Brass, any more questions?
Not as far as I can think of. What about you, Engine?
Not at the moment. We should be wrapping up soon. Is there any projects you're working on? Anything you want to share?
No, I don't tend to make plans. I do things kind of impromptu. It kind of goes with living moment to moment, which is really necessary for the spiritual path. Not always looking forward to the future so that you miss the life that you're living right now. Someone asks, who is your favorite atheist philosopher, I don't keep track of that. I'm very much focused on the contemplative path. So, no, I don't have any plans. I make a video or two on my YouTube channel once a week as far as my outreach goes online, but that's it. I don't make plans, as Jesus said, give no thought for the morrow. Just, see what happens.
Okay. Any final thoughts you want to express, Brass?
No, I think this was a very good discussion from what I can tell. It was interesting finding someone that actually did know about Plato and Aristotle. I always felt kind of lonely in that.
Yeah, I was saying to Luca not long ago that I've actually seen a few live streams of a certain other group that you two have been involved in, and I know that you mentioned philosophers a lot. I remember that about you.
Okay, this has been a HistoryNet podcast with Mr. Brass and Drew Gildas of Gnostic Ministries. I'll see you next time. Or whenever.
See ya.